And we're live, eh?
There, we are live. Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton. We are doing a debate today, joined by Blazek, an Eastern Orthodox, and we're discussing the thesis. We're debating the thesis. Does Catholicism dogmatically teach all unbaptized babies must go to hell when they die? So quite a mouthful there. How are you, Al?
I'm doing fine. Thanks, Michael. Sorry. Oh, are we still there?
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, sorry. I think I had the YouTube tab open and it started to stream.
So you started to hear an echo in there.
Yeah,
I've done that before.
I closed it down, so we're good to go there.
I've made that mistake quite a few times, and then it threw me off in the introduction. So I've been there. I hear you. Yeah. Well, look, hey, I'm really glad, you reached out to me and we were talking about, differences between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And this came up, and I read your article that you that you wrote in 2018. And I thought there were some really interesting points in there worth discussing. So I'm glad that you're willing to, have a dialogue with me on this, and I hope it's fruitful.
Yeah, likewise. Look, I know it's arranged as a debate, and that's perfectly fine. I just want to let everyone know my bias so that they don't go, "What's this guy doing?" First is I'm not a formal theologian, and so if you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, feel free to raise it in chat. And I know that there's already some debate going on in chat about some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. And the second is, to me, conversing, rightly or wrongly, I have a bias towards conversing as opposed to debating. I used to, when I was a Catholic, I watched and listened to a lot of debates. Those of you who are Catholic out there watching, James White from Alpha Omega Ministries did a lot of Calvinist type debates. And I just found that a lot of those debates devolved into a lot of heat with very little light. And I mean that in both directions. And so I just want to try to keep this as non-polemic as possible. If I cross the line or Michael does, in other words, we have serious disagreements, but we want to try to keep it civil. Otherwise, there's not going to be a whole lot of light generated. So that's my goal. And so if you're wondering, why is Al talking about this but not that, that's probably why. It's at least the theory.
And look, I appreciate that sentiment a lot, because I'm really tired of the polemics. I've seen it for years. I've been subject to it for years. I'm sick of it. Me personally, I want to know the truth. I want to get to the bottom of the truth. I don't care about whether I look good or bad, whether I, was initially right or wrong. I just want to know the truth. And so, my perspective is we can have major disagreements, but do it in a charitable way, because if both of us are just trying to get to the truth, there's no need for the rhetoric and the polemic and, all that. So I really do appreciate them.
Right. And I do too. And I just want to point out to people who are watching, I think both of us, Michael and I, have talked a lot about this, want to walk a fine line. So there's the one error, which is, Orthodoxy and Catholicism are the same. It really doesn't matter. That's one error. The other error would be that, anyone who's Orthodox or Catholic is just a complete idiot and is being disingenuous, because obviously X, pick whatever side you want, is so obviously the case that anybody can see it without doing any sort of prayer or research or anything like that. So if you disagree, Michael, feel free to contradict me, but I think those are the twin errors, the Scylla and Charybdis I'm trying to navigate between. So
I appreciate that metaphor too. I'm a fan of the old classics. So all right. Well, let's go ahead and do it. I mean, roughly, this is, again, a very loose debate, more of a debate dialogue discussion, if you will. So what I want to do is I want to kind of give us some basic time parameters, but it's perfectly fine to not fulfill them, so if you don't meet the time parameter, perfectly fine. If you go over it and you have more content to offer, perfectly fine as well. These aren't, hard and fast rules, but I was just mainly thinking it would be good for both of us to do 2 10-minute opening statements, 2 10-minute rebuttals. Let's see, 4 10-minute cross-examinations, and then 2 5-minute closings. Again, nothing hard and fast here. It's just to kind of keep us on track, because I know we have some time constraints. So we're roughly looking at about 90 minutes, if all goes well, give or take.
Mhm.
And then, of course, maybe a little bit of live chat questions at the very end. So hold off on your chat questions until, I'll let you know, maybe towards the beginning of the first closing statement. That should be fine. Okay, so Al,
Mhm.
you're taking the affirmative that the Catholic Church teaches that unbaptized babies dogmatically teaches that they must go to hell when they die. Did I get you correct there? Are we in
Right.
agreement on the thesis here?
Right, and I appreciate that, Michael. You and I went back and forth on the wording. Yes. So,
Mhm.
uh, and should I just jump in with a little bit of my background at this
Yeah.
point, or do
So
you want to,
go ahead, give
or do
your
you have a?
background, your opening, all that. Mhm.
Okay, sure. So what Michael said is true. That's my position. I was Catholic for 40 years. I was in the Novus Ordo Church being brought up. Was disenchanted by the Novus Ordo like a lot of people. Ended up in the Melkite Church, where I formally switched right. So my bishop formally signed off on it. At the time, I don't know, I can't remember if it was Bishop Nicholas Samra. For those of you who know him, great guy. I think
Mhm.
he signed off
Mhm.
on my acceptance of right. So I was in the Catholic Church for about 40 years. So what I always said to anyone, and I've talked several Protestants into Catholicism by looking at the historical roots of Catholicism, is I've said, if you can show me something where Catholicism teaches error, even one, I'll
Mhm.
leave, because it's an infallible
Mhm.
church. An infallible church cannot teach with infallibility something that is wrong. Now, any one Catholic can teach something that's wrong. For those of you watching who are trads, Father Richard McBrien spouts all sorts of nonsense, as does James, the Jesuit guy whose name is escaping me. I think everyone out there knows who I'm talking to. He's on the news a lot. But in any event, so I'm talking about actual dogmatically binding statements. Above and beyond my background, so I don't go too much into that. Michael, you can talk about it some more if you want. I have 7 children. My wife has had 4 miscarriages. When we went to bury one of our miscarried children, what I was told is the baby died outside of the church. So I started looking at it and saying, well, okay, so that's weird, because I was always taught the baby has baptism of desire because we're the parents and we desire to have this child, this son, in the church. And what we found was that dogmatically, this is a settled statement of fact in the Catholic Church. And it is settled in a very clear and compelling way, saying that this child is outside of the church and is dogmatically in hell. And not only is he dogmatically in hell, but this has been reinforced by at least 3, I would say more like 4 or 5 ecumenical councils. So one of the baseline positions I'll take in this debate is that if one of the 23 ecumenical councils of the Catholic Church have stated something, then it is no longer subject to debate. Arianism is no longer subject to debate. Nestorianism, iconoclasm, monothelism, monophilitism. If you look at the post-schism councils of the Catholic Church, Florence, Lyon, Lateran, Trent, Vatican I, all of them reaffirm that those who die in actual sin, mortal sin, or original sin only go straightway to hell, although to be punished with different punishments. So my child is in hell, according to Catholic teaching. It's a nice hell. I put nice in quotes, but it will be resurrected in a damned body at the end of the age, and um, uh, they don't suffer pain. One of the popes, I need to pull up my old article to remember this, but one of the popes in the 17th, 18th century, 17th century said this. So anyways, I didn't mean to go off on that, Michael, but
You're
that's
fine.
my general thesis for what I'm talking about today. I don't need to belabor it for 10 minutes, but what it comes down to is, has the Catholic Church spoken infallibly on this topic? Yes or no? Did the Catholic Church believe it? Like the
Mhm.
people, did they believe it in this way for hundreds of years? Yes or no? If
Mhm.
so, can a council directly contradict an earlier council? Yes or no? And that's kind of the basis in a nutshell. I would say the Catholic Church taught it. They taught it clearly. They taught it at 5 different councils. Vatican II tried to unwind it, And so it creates this awkward situation where either we have to reject Vatican II, or we have to reject multiple councils before Vatican II, or we have to say Vatican II was a pastoral council not intending to teach anything binding. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. And then layered on top, everyone believed this. Even my parents who are still alive, they would tell you they used to have these certificates where they prayed for pagan babies who were in limbo, which is the highest level of hell. But we'll get to that. So I think I'm done. Hopefully I didn't take 10 minutes. I don't think I did based on the
No.
timing.
No, you didn't, and that's fine. You don't have to take the full time. I very well may not, or then again, I very well may go over it. So, again, it's just kind of loose time parameters so that we don't go over our potentially 2-hour discussion here. So, anyways, let's go ahead and get to it. I'll give you my opening here. So, when it comes to this issue, all right, does Catholicism dogmatically teach all unbaptized babies must go to hell upon their death? I would say there are some preliminary considerations that we need to make, because I think that there were some things that you said in your opening that perhaps do not account for some of these considerations. So let me give them. First of all, why is this even being discussed? Why is this even an issue? Well, Scripture has at least two scriptural tensions. It gives us the universal salvific will of God. We see this in many passages, but especially 1 Timothy 2:3-4, where it tells us that God desires all men to be saved. So there is that parameter there that we have to navigate within. So there's kind of some scriptural guardrails here. God wants everyone to be saved. Now, we could distinguish between God's antecedent and consequent will, and perhaps we can get into that later, but I do want to note that there is a distinction there. Now, the other guardrail, if you will, on the other end of the spectrum that Scripture gives us is the necessity of baptism. You see this in John 3:5, and it actually is in reference to water baptism, because the immediate context, not only does the verse actually speak about water and the Holy Spirit, but the immediate context in chapter 4 is the disciples baptizing individuals. So it's clear that Jesus was referring to a new birth, being born again of water and spirit. So it is water baptism that he's referring to. So again, in Scripture, you have these two principles that we have to stay within. God wants everyone to be saved, but at the same time, he says you have to be baptized with water in order to enter into the kingdom of God. So what do we do here? Well, this is what really gave rise to a lot of these discussions when it comes to limbo and our very thesis today. Now, another thing that I wanted to address is some preliminary terms. For example, we are talking about babies going to hell. What exactly is hell? There are multiple compartments to hell, if you will. I mean, you might not like the term compartment, different, you will. There, for one, is the hell of the damned. This is Gehenna. This is where individuals who have committed actual sins, they have actually done something evil, contrary to God's law. This is where they go if they die outside of God's friendship. Okay. Where, for example, an infant would go, because an infant has not committed any actual sins. So the hell of the damned needs to be distinguished from other compartments of hell. And I'm getting this, number one, from the Summa Theologica, but you can also find it elsewhere. You also have what's called limbo of the fathers, also known as Abraham's bosom in Luke, I want to say 16, in paradise, where Jesus told the thief on the cross that you will be with me on this day in paradise. So it's the same place, just different names. Is where the righteous people went prior to the ascension of Christ, prior to him opening up the gates of heaven to the Old Testament righteous. They went to the limbo of the fathers. Again, Abraham's bosom, paradise. It's arguably empty now, because you see in the book of Ephesians, Christ led them on high. So we would want to distinguish between the hell of the damned, limbo of the fathers, and then also what's called limbo of infants. And this is, of course, a theoretical position where infants who die in a state of original sin because they do not have actual sin would go when they die. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about limbo of infants, but let's just kind of put a pause on that. There's also what's called Tartarus. Some people put this under the category of hell of the damned, but this is where the fallen angels go. I think you can see this in, I want to say Second Peter, First or Second Peter, but this is where the angels who rebelled against God, where they have been sent to for eternity. Again, it could be just part of hell of the damned. It could be its own compartment. That's debatable. Then some people might classify purgatory as part of hell. I don't like that category. I really think that is definitely misleading, because all purgatory is this is where the righteous go who simply have temporal punishment that they need to satisfy. So they are not damned. They are not lost. They are going to experience the beatific vision or heaven. They are going to see the face of God. They have some temporal satisfaction that they atone for. And we could discuss what exactly purgatory is. Is it a location? Is it an experience, an encounter with Christ? That's a whole nother subject. But I don't really like putting purgatory under the category of hell, but I just mention it there because some people might say it's a compartment of hell, if you will. So when we speak about unbaptized babies going to hell, we have to distinguish, what do we mean? Do we mean hell of the damned? Absolutely not. That they would go to hell of the damned. Augustine, for example, very early on in his theology, believed that they did not go to the hell of the damned. And I'm speaking here of unbaptized infants who die in their infancy. He actually believed that they went to an intermediate place, a place that we would call, although he doesn't use that term. But later on in his life, even before the Pelagian controversy, he reformed that view and believed that they do go to the hell of the damned, but he believed that they did not experience any kind of serious torture or punishment. He said that they experienced a mild punishment, so mild that he actually says that it would be better to exist and experience that punishment rather than to not exist at all. That was his position, and that's pretty much the most severe position, if you will, historically. Many theologians did not agree with him. Some did, Jerome, Anselm, for example, but many took issue with him, beginning with Peter Abelard to Peter Lombard to St. Thomas Aquinas and quite a few others after him. They disagreed with Augustine on that point and said that if a unbaptized baby dies in a state of original sin, they would go to a place called limbo, which just simply is Latin for fringe or border. And this would be a place of perfect natural happiness. And in fact, they would say that there was no experience of pain. Most of the theologians would say this. There was no experience of pain. And in fact, there's nothing but an experience of natural joy and natural communion with God. So actual natural unity with God, and perhaps even experience with, family members who are in heaven. So there was maybe some kind of communion and communication there as well. So, I mean, worst case scenario, they were taking the position that, if an infant dies in this state of original sin, they're going to a place of perfect natural happiness. Now, they would not experience, according to these theologians, supernatural happiness, the beatific vision. They would actually not experience heaven, but they again would have this natural happiness and natural communion with God. So when we see some theologians throughout history talking about infants going to hell, oftentimes that's what they're referring to. So I do want to mention that. Now, he says, does the Catholic Church teach that unbaptized infants, of course, who die in original state of original sin, must go to hell? Now, what is dogma? This is often misunderstood. Dogma is something that is taught in sacred scripture, sacred tradition, and has been solemnly defined by the Catholic Church as definitive, either by an ex cathedra teaching or a silly definition of an ecumenical council, or has been defined by what we call the ordinary and universal magisterium. And I want to explain what that means, because it's extremely important to our discussion today, because much of this hinges on understanding what the magisterium is, how it works, how it functions. So let me briefly touch on that. What is an ex cathedra teaching? This is when, according to Vatican I, the Pope, in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, defines a doctrine concerning faith and morals to be held by the universal church. Now, there are 4 aspects in there. If you press rewind and listen to it again, there's 4 things in there. He has to, in the exercise of his office as the universal shepherd, and he also has to call on his supreme apostolic authority. He defines a matter of faith and morals and binds the universal church to hold this, to be held by the whole church. There's 4 aspects to it. If those 4 aspects are not there in this papal teaching, it is not ex cathedra according to Vatican I. And that's very important, because I think that perhaps there are people who think that some things were taught ex cathedra by a pope on this matter that are actually not ex cathedra according to Vatican I's definition. There's also, again, what I refer to as an ecumenical council. This is where you have a universal or general council that is in union with the Pope, that defines a matter of faith and morals. Some of the ways that we can identify it is terminology like "we define," or they will use canons along with anathemas. And of course, we could also look at the acta, that is the proceedings of an ecumenical council, and we can get a feel for what was their intent. Were they intending to define this, or was it just something that they taught, but not with the intention of teaching it definitively? So looking at the acta is important. But I did mention that the ecumenical council could use the term "we define," and that might be a signal that it's using definitive language, but not always so. There are actually instances in which an ecumenical council, and even a pope, uses the term "we define," "we decree," and they actually did not have the intent of definitively teaching a matter of faith and morals. And I can give you several examples of that. And I could show you these examples in the preconciliar church for anybody who thinks that, you know, I'm relying on stuff that is after the Second Vatican Council. I could actually show those changes in the preconciliar church. So that tells us terms like "we define," "we decree," they're helpful in signaling that something is definitive and infallible, but there's no hard, fast rule here. There's no perfect formula. The Council of Nicaea, for instance, when it defined the matter of Jesus being homoousios with the Father, didn't use any particular formula. So we have to be careful not to read too much into some of these church documents. The ordinary and universal magisterium, and this can definitively teach a matter of faith and morals. It's much, much harder to establish. What the ordinary and universal magisterium essentially is you have bishops scattered throughout the world, so they're not, you know, assembled in a council like an ecumenical council, but they are teaching in union with the Pope.
Hey, Michael,
they hold that something is definitive. Yeah.
Hey, just to jump in, has it been 10 minutes? It feels like it's been a while. I've been writing some notes down.
I think I'm a little bit over. Is it okay if I continue to elaborate this, or do you want a moment to jump in?
It's fine. What I don't want to do is have a gunny sack stuff where we're talking at people for 15 minutes, because I realize that I'm already starting to lose some of the points that you're making. And so I've been taking notes. Luckily, I can type pretty fast. But what I don't want to do is ignore things that you're saying. So if we can try to make it shorter, great. If not, please finish your point, and I'll do the best I can.
I'll do my best. This is extremely pertinent to the assertions that you're making, so I'm having to lay them out. I'll do my best to try to wrap it up quickly, though. The ordinary and universal magisterium, these are bishops who are teaching in union with the Pope, but outside of an ecumenical council, and they are teaching something as definitive. So if the bishops and the Pope, even outside of a council, have constantly and universally throughout the ages taught something as definitive, even if it's not ecumenical council, even if it's not ex cathedra, it is universally binding. But it's much harder to establish that because you have to show that this was the constant and universal teaching and that they intended for it to be taught definitively. One of the ways you can establish that is through the consensus of church fathers, theologians, and the sense of the faithful. But again, it's a lot harder to establish. This is going to definitely come up with some of the points that you're making, though, so I want to address it. Establish that some of these conciliar teachings and some of these papal teachings were taught infallibly, and canon law teaches us that nothing is to be understood as definitive or as defined infallibly unless it's manifestly evident. Now, manifestly evident means you have to prove, you have to show that this is clearly the constant and universal teaching. And I'm getting that straight from Pope, I want to say Pius the Ninth. I can actually get the quote later on, but Pope Pius the Ninth, I believe, was the one who said that something that has been taught manifestly and clearly is something that is constant and universal. So that's going to have to be something that, in my opinion, you have to establish. You can't just say, well, a Pope said this or an ecumenical council said this. You have to actually show that it's infallible by demonstrating it has been that is infallible. Now, two last points that I wanted to mention, and I'll wrap it up and pass it over to you. There is two things going on here. I would agree it's extremely likely to be definitive. In other words, it's probably infallible that the church teaches that if somebody dies in a state of original sin, that they would be deprived of the beatific vision, which would mean that they either go to the hell of the damned or limbo, although the vast majority of Catholics did not believe that they went to the hell of the damned. So it would be, in limbo that they would go to, but that they would be deprived of the beatific vision if they die in a state of original sin. I would agree with you. That's probably definitive. Here's where I won't agree with you. I do not believe that the church has definitively taught that unbaptized infants who die as an infant, that they actually die in a state of original sin. They could die in a state of original sin. According to the Council of Trent, everybody contracts the sin of original sin. So they could die in that state, and in that case, they would go to limbo. But the Catholic Church never definitively or dogmatically teaches that an infant actually does die in the state of original sin. In fact, you have two magisterial documents in the post-conciliar church that teach contrary to that, that they actually say that there is hope that we can entrust them to the mercy of God. And I can give you some examples of those later on. And it also leads us to this last point, and then I'll pass it over to you. This essentially means there's three options here. All infants could go to limbo. Some infants could go to limbo and some infants could go to heaven, or all infants could go to heaven, because the Catholic Church recognizes there could be what's called an extra sacramental way in which God could give the infant right before they die the necessary graces to go to heaven. In other words, he could give them the graces of the sacrament of baptism right before they die. It's possible. We don't know in any particular case that he actually does give this to an infant, but we also don't know that he doesn't. So again, it could mean that all infants are in limbo because none of them had their original sin wiped away. It could mean that all infants are in heaven because all of them had their original sin wiped away before they died. Or it could mean that some are in limbo because they didn't have their original sin wiped away, and some had their original sin wiped away through some extra sacramental means here. So I would say, based on those distinctions, based on what I just laid out, the Catholic Church does not dogmatically teach that all infants must go to hell. So you're going to have to prove, and it's going to have to be manifestly established, that the Catholic Church actually teaches infallibly that God never gives them an extra sacramental means of grace to go to heaven. So sorry
Okay.
for taking over my
Yeah,
10
I think
minutes, but
you
I
know,
had to establish
I
all
really
that.
don't want to be dogmatic, but I'm afraid in the future, I'm going to have to try to cut you off at 10 minutes. I think that one went almost 20, and it's not so much that I'm against you, Michael.
Did it?
I'm taking a ton of notes, and I get it. We want to get all of this out
Right.
on the table, but I want to also be able to respond to everything, and it's kind of hard unless we take it piecemeal. So the first thing first, we could have saved a few minutes. I'll direct everyone who's watching this. Taylor Marshall, whose video with Tim Flanders on Orthodoxy was unfortunately quite horrible, has a great video on this. On the 4 levels of hell. This is what's dogmatically defined in the Catholic Church. This is what's taught by Thomas Aquinas, and is a good review of what Michael just said. It's 15 minutes long. It's very easy to understand. And the 4 levels of hell are simply just, in Catholic teaching, limbo, purgatory, limbo of the fathers, and then whatever you want to call the place of the damned, Gehenna, whatever. So those are the 4 levels of hell. Limbo is a level of hell, and it is dogmatically defined. So I'm going to try to go and address some of the things you said, Michael, and then I'll try to lay out kind of what Catholicism says. So a few things, and I'm not really sure what order to do these in, because again, you hit a whole bunch of things. Is there a way, Michael, for us to share a link in the chat? Because what I'd like to do, because I can spout this stuff off, but people can say, well, that's not true. I'd like to link at least to the article I wrote about, unbaptized
Mhm.
children. I don't see a place where I can put that in the chat, but
I can add it afterwards if that would be helpful. I
I
don't
just think
know
it's
a way.
more helpful than what I'm going to say right now. For instance, when you
Mhm,
say what happens to children,
mhm,
and again, this is going to be out of order because you hit a whole bunch of things. But in 1794, Pius VI had to deal with the fate of unbaptized infants after multiple ecumenical councils that condemned them to hell. At that time, the Jansenist crisis was going on in Catholicism. Jansenists are an ultra rigorous sect, and one of their teachings was babies suffer the pain of fire in hell. And if you say that they don't, you're a heretic. Paul VI came out and said, nah, you guys are the heretics. And here's the quote that's from my article. The Jansenist doctrine, which rejects as a Pelagian fable that place the lower regions, which the faithfully generally designate by the name of limbo of the children, in which souls of those departing with the sole guilt of original sin are punished with the punishment of the condemned, exclusive of fire. This Jansenist rejection is false, rash, and injurious to Catholic schools. So again, it's easier to see it than to hear me spit it off. But what he was saying is, look, they're in hell. They're definitely in hell. But if you say that they're suffering the pain of fire, you're the heretics. And so there was no debate over this. There, just like some of the early doctrines of the church on baptism, where the only discussion was, should we wait 8 days to baptize children, like circumcision? And there are some equal sort of statements like this saying, no, it's wrong to wait 8 days to baptize children. Go ahead and baptize them as soon as you want. Um, this is a statement by a pope. Now, we can argue whether that's infallible or not, but the key thing here is that Paul VI is reiterating what had already been taught infallibly by Catholicism in the post-schism age. So that's another point I want to point out. If we look at the first 1,000 years of Christendom, when Orthodoxy was won, before the Catholic schism, we all had one very, for lack of a better term, hazy view on salvation, which is we have glorified saints, canonized, if you like that word, in Catholicism. We had glorified saints. We had a very small number of people through the liturgy of the church that we define as being in hell. There's actually 4, as far as I can tell. Yes, 4. But we have a whole class of people that we just do not know about. Objectively and necessarily, you need to be baptized to be saved. And that was Michael's discussion about John 3, and there's tons of them. I think it's Titus 3:15, where it talks about water is the laver of regeneration. Baptism now saves you. All those things are true. All of them are true. What matters, though, is that how are they true? Are they absolutely positively true? If you are not baptized, are you going to hell? The Feeneyite branch of Catholicism would say yes. The vast majority of Catholics would say no, and that the Feeneyites are heretic. They allow for 2 options other than this: baptism of desire and baptism of blood. Without turning this into a 5-hour-long conversation, you who are Catholic can go research this. Baptism and desire and blood are not commutative. You cannot have baptism of desire for your unborn children. You cannot have baptism of blood for your unborn children. those are for people who have died sincerely desiring to join, again in Catholic theology, the Catholic faith. And so we're back to the same problem again, which is, so what happens to these unbaptized children? So before I move on, Pope Pius the Sixth, the document, in case you can't see it, is Auctorem Fidei, Auctorem. You can look that one up. Now we're going to go to some of the ecumenical councils of the church. And just to remind Catholics who may not be as learned on this, ecumenical councils are councils of some sort of gathering of the whole church. Not all of them were. There were a couple ecumenical councils only attended by Eastern bishops, but which still have the seal and the requirement of all of us to affirm to it. The first ecumenical council, Arianism, St. Nicholas punching out Arius, for those of you familiar with it. That's settled fact. Christ is divine. He's not the most perfectly created being. We can't go back and undo it. Monophysitism and monothelitism. Christ has two natures. Christ has two wills. Pope Honorius was anathematized and condemned at the Sixth Ecumenical Council for rejection of this. The Seventh Ecumenical Council on iconoclasm. The only reason I'm going down this road a little bit is to point out that we can't, this is settled fact. We can't go back and say, well, we can nuance this away. So now, that said, there are 23 ecumenical councils of the Catholic Church. Let's look at these. The Council of Florence, Session 11, from Pope Eugene IV. Ex cathedra statement. Regarding children, indeed, because of the danger of death which can often take place when no help can be brought to them by another remedy than through the sacrament of baptism, through which they are snatched from the dominion of the devil and adopted among the sons of God, it is advised that holy baptism ought not to be deferred for 40 or 80 days or any time, according to the observance of certain people. Okay, that's an interesting one. How about the Council of Trent, Paul III? If anyone says that recently born babies should not be baptized, or that indeed they are baptized for the remission of sins but incur no trace of original sin, let him be anathema. If we go back and look at the explicit statements that talk about it, the Second Council of Lyon has the exact statement: the souls of those who die in mortal sin or in original sin only is meant immediately descend to hell, yet to be punished with different punishments. John the 22nd confirms, Pope John the 22nd, the Roman Catholic Church teaches that the souls of those who die in mortal sin or with original sin only descend immediately to hell, however to be punished with different penalties and in different places. That's why limbo is a separate area of hell, non-smoking, as you might say, than bad hell. Then we have Florence, which was the so-called reunification council that tried to reunify the Orthodox Church as one church. The souls of those who depart in actual mortal sin or in original sin only descend immediately to hell, but undergo punishments of a different kind. So we have here, right here, 3 ecumenical councils that explicitly talked about what happens to these children who die, who do not have baptism. And they go out of their way to say, or in original sin only. Who has original sin only? Only those who are not old enough to commit actual sin. In Catholic theology, this would be those who are below the age of reason. I'm just kind of looking at the chat, just so you all know, I can't respond to the chat. I wish I could. I would be throwing my document up there. You can go to Russian Faith and you can look up the word unbaptized to see my article on, the Catholic Church teaches that unbaptized babies cannot go to heaven, because that's where I'm kind of referring to a lot of this stuff from, and you can follow along. Matthew in the chat says, isn't all this irrelevant now because of Vatican II? No, it's not. In fact, I guess it's both relevant and irrelevant. It's Schrodinger's relevancy. If Vatican II is correct, then the Catholic Church is in error, and you need to get to orthodoxy like right now. If the Vatican II Church is incorrect, well, then you got a problem, because it's an ecumenical council. You can say it's a pastoral or a teaching council. That never has existed in the history of the church. But you do have a problem, because it says something remarkably different than at least 4 other ecumenical Catholic councils. And what was believed by Catholicism up until the time of my very parents, who are 91 years old, who are still alive, has only changed in the last 70 years. It's very similar to how Catholics have tried to change teaching on birth control, and even Orthodox, to my shame. That matter is settled. And that's not even ecumenical council. There's no ecumenical council condemning birth control. There's just the combined historical universal teaching condemning it. This actually has ecumenical councils behind it. You don't have to have an ecumenical council to believe something, but once it's there, it's there. And so this is where Orthodoxy and Catholicism really split ways in the post-schism world. Orthodoxy has said very explicitly, my baptismal name is Varus, 4th century saint. He saved a pagan child of St. Cleopatra who died as a pagan. St. John is in heaven. St. Gregory the Great, St. Gregory the Dialogus, prayed for Trajan, the condemned emperor who he had a vision who was in hell. He prayed Trajan out of hell. Trajan is not a Christian, was not baptized. So we have a whole bunch of issues here that need to be addressed. I haven't addressed all of them. I don't want to go over long because I think I've taken 10 minutes. But you can tell me
if you need to, though.
Well, tell me which things I didn't address of yours, because I want to make sure that I'm not ignoring anything. I wanted to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas and how the system that developed in Catholicism, because they had to accept it with these statements, was Thomas Aquinas said, look, there's predestination in a very, he wouldn't say it this way, but in a very Calvinistic sense. There are those who are not predestined to either grace or glory. They definitely go to hell. There are those who are predestined to grace, those who receive baptism, but who do not die in the bosom of the Catholic Church. They go to hell. But you have to be predestined to grace and glory. If you're predestined to both, then you go to heaven. So you see that one teaching that those who die in original sin go to hell, and the definition of original sin being warped leads to a whole bunch of, again, from the Orthodox perspective, errors with respect to salvation. Because to say that the unbaptized can be saved, to say that adults can be saved outside of Catholicism, is really a rejection of what Catholicism has taught for at least 900 years. Because for the first 1,000 years, we were kind of united in, look, we just don't know, guys. We just don't know. And there have been local councils that have said more or less on this point. But again, local councils are not dogmatically binding. They do not bind the whole church. We have local councils that have taught error, absolutely, and it's pretty manifest that they have. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I haven't touched upon. Is there anything you can think of that I didn't touch in what you were talking about, Michael? Because I want to make sure that at least I'm not ignoring something that you brought up.
That you're fine. You're interacting with a lot of good stuff, and I have a lot of material to respond to as well. No, you're good.
Okay, I just want to make one more statement because I saw somebody writing in chat. Does prayer get children out of limbo? Remember, we're talking about two things here. I'm saying the Catholic Church's teaching is incorrect. Orthodoxy does not have limbo. There is, and I'm not a theologian, so Orthodox theologians jump in. There is a place I like to call Hades, because until the final judgment, a person's place is not set in Orthodoxy. Once the final judgment is there and you're in the lake of fire, you're there forever, dude. Trajan was in Hades. He died. Bad dude. Killed Christians like crazy. St. Gregory read about Trajan and how kind he was to a widowed woman, where he stopped in the midst of going to battle to listen to her complaints and take care of her, that he felt pity and prayed fervently for him until he received a revelation in his dialogues. You have prayed Trajan out of the depths of hell. And then he was essentially warned, don't do that again. I mean, from an angel. So, okay. So that's a little bit different than the Catholic concept that once you're in hell, you're in hell. If you're a baby and you're in limbo, that's hell. It sounds nicer than hell. It feels nicer than hell. I'll give them that. But you're still going to be resurrected with a damned body. You're still going to be in hell, separated. And this is where maybe Michael and I disagree based on my reading of Aquinas. You will be absolutely separated from God and from your parents and from your family and from the saints for all eternity. You're in a place of natural happiness. It's like an eternal daycare, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if daycares are that happy, but it's like an eternal, I don't know, pick something you like. And so they don't suffer. And for that, I'm eternally grateful, so that people who mourn don't have to mourn the way they would in Augustine's time, when Augustine taught, hey, these babies have to suffer the fires of hell. They have sin. It's the way it is. And as Michael said, he kind of went through some iterations. He went back and forth. He kind of renounced some stuff in his confessions near the end of his life. But the reality is that this is a huge, huge difference between the Catholic view and the Orthodox view. And it's eminently practical. We probably need to have another debate on what about adults, because we're not even talking about adults. Adults are a whole different kettle of fish. What about that 10-year-old Protestant kid who has actual sins and who dies without baptism? Oh, he's definitely going to hell, and he's going to bad hell. So putting that aside for a second, just realize we're focused on babies.
Yeah.
Those
Right.
of you who are out there who are parents, we have 4
Yeah.
miscarried children: Lazarus, Moses, Nathaniel, Alfred. According to Catholic theology, they're all in hell, dogmatically. We buried them. We pray for them. We have very good hope that they're in heaven. We don't have any guarantee, but we have very good hope they're in heaven. They've committed no actual sin. So I guess I'll leave it at that because I'm way over my 10 minutes now, and I'll defer
Hey,
back.
you're fine. I went over my time constraints. You can as well. There's no really strict rules here. Perfectly fine. Whatever points you need to make, that's fine. Um,
And
all
to
right,
confirm
so
people in the chat real quick, yes, it's Pope St. Gregory the Great in Catholic parlance. St. Gregory the Dialogist, he's sometimes called, because he wrote a bunch of books called the Dialogues. So look that up. You'll find it.
all right, so you bring up Auctorum Fidei, 1794. Well, a lot going on in this apostolic constitution, of course, by Pope Pius VI. I would agree that this apostolic constitution is probably an infallible instance of the papal magisterium. So it's probably ex cathedra. That doesn't mean everything in an ex cathedra document is infallible. And we know, in fact, quite the contrary. And I would say this particular portion of the apostolic constitution, there's absolutely no definitive language in there. We have no reason when he's speaking here about limbo that anything is being defined dogmatically. And there's a whole host of theologians who would back me up on that. Here's what he does deny, though. He says, the doctrine which rejects as a Pelagian fable that the place of lower regions, which the faithful generally designate by the limbo of children, blah, 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 blah. What he's doing is he's saying it is wrong to say that limbo is a Pelagian fable. That is what he is, and I can't say he's condemning. That is what he is writing against. That is the position he's rejecting. And I would agree with him. It's not a Pelagian fable to affirm limbo, not at all. Moreover, in addition to the fact that there's no definitive language for this portion, so there's no reason to believe that it was infallible, this really doesn't pose any issues here and doesn't establish your position, because he's nowhere excluding that an infant could be given some kind of extra sacramental grace, the grace of baptism, outside of the sacrament of water baptism. He's not excluding that position. He's not even addressing it at all. So this position doesn't really establish what you're saying. He's just saying
if I can jump in so we don't go for minutes, but I promise I'll be brief. If you want to pass on this, I agree. This statement of all the ones I've made is the weakest, primarily because it's not an ecumenical council. It's made by one pope in a constitution. I think what I'm saying is we have to look at things practically, though, too. Is this a reflection of what Catholicism believed? Like, was there this outrage reaction? Are you kidding me? Of course babies aren't in hell. No. So it's a clue. It's not, it's not a slam dunk, but it's a clue. Just like all the other things we're talking, I'm trying to show a pattern of. So if you were a Catholic in 1750, no internet, no phone, no nothing, and you found out that the Pope said this, what was your response? And the response I'm arguing was a yawn, because my parents believed it in the 20th century.
I mean, I think that the Pope is saying here that one can believe in limbo. I think he's asserting that. But he's saying that nobody should be saying that this is a Pelagian fable. In fact, quite the contrary. So I think he believed in limbo of infants. And I think he was defending it as a theological possibility. Let me move on to some other things that you said, though.
Real quickly, and I promise I'll be quick. I ask everyone to go to the Russian Faith website. Again, I wish I could put a link in the chat, but I can't.
I'll include it at the bottom of the YouTube link once it posts.
But you'll read that it's a little bit convoluted, which I admit sometimes they are in translation. But he's saying, look, the Jansenist doctrine, which rejects this idea of limbo, is false, rash, and injurious to Catholic schools. So he's literally saying, here's what limbo is. It's hell minus the fire. That's exactly what it says.
But he's nowhere saying that infants must dogmatically die in that. He's nowhere dogmatically teaches this, and he's nowhere saying they must die in a state of original sin. So I don't think that this can be called as a proof for your position. Now, you also mentioned that
Okay, two things. One, we agree that it does
well,
not have the same binding as an ecumenical
let me
council.
finish here. You can always come back in the cross examination and tease this out further, but let me respond a little bit more with my rebuttal. You mentioned baptism of desire; it can't be communicated. In fact, there are quite a few theologians who would disagree. Of course, Cardinal Cayetan, who believed in vicarious baptism of the desire. There are also others who would assert that infants who die, for example, in the case of an abortion, that there's an element of baptism of blood that could possibly be applied there. So there's quite a few who would disagree with you on that. You said that conciliar teachings can't be nuanced. There are, in fact, many instances in which ecumenical councils not only nuanced previous ecumenical councils, but some ecumenical councils actually overturned decisions of other ecumenical councils. So I wouldn't agree with that. You also mentioned that
Can you
Florence.
give me an example of a council that
Yeah,
overturned a
yeah,
decision of a
absolutely.
previous
The fifth
ecumenical council?
council, the Fifth Ecumenical Council overturned the view on Ebos, Theodore, the three chapters that was established in the Fourth Ecumenical Council. But again, we can talk about that more in the cross examination. Let me respond to some of the things that you said as I'm in my rebuttal here. You mentioned that Florence is definitive, that it dogmatically teaches limbo. That's actually not at all the case. Florence is an ecumenical council, but not everything taught by an ecumenical council is definitive. Now, in the context of the two statements that the Council of Florence actually adopts that are relevant to our discussion here, there's really no indication that it is using any definitive language. It does not use any canons. It does not use we define or decree for this context. It does not use any anathemas. So you might say that it still is, iterating something that was previously taught definitively, but it itself does not actually definitively teach that those who die in a state of original sin are deprived of the beatific vision. Now, even if it does, that's perfectly fine. Even if, let's say, Florence dogmatically taught, if you die in a state of original sin, you're deprived of the beatific vision, you go to hell to suffer different pains from those who are in hell of the damned. Even if you want to say that that's dogmatic, which I would challenge, that doesn't mean that an infant can't have their original sin removed before they die. Of course, if you die in a state of original sin, yes, then you would be deprived of the beatific vision. We're in agreement there. The question is, must an infant die in a state of original sin? They can die in a state of original sin because we know that they contract original sin according to the Council of Trent. But must they die in that state? Absolutely not. In fact, the Catholic Church has taught differently than that. You've mentioned Vatican II perhaps overturning some things. Vatican II didn't overturn anything. Especially when it comes to this particular topic, when it comes to Gaudium et Spes, all it says, and I'm assuming that's what you're referring to, Gaudium et Spes, section 22, all it says is that God offers salvation to everyone in ways only known to God, only known to God. In other words, everyone has the opportunity to be saved. It might be through some means only known to God, but everyone has that. That is not contradicting Florence. That's not contradicting anything previously taught, because those previous teachings of those ecumenical councils and popes were saying if you die in a state of original sin, then you're deprived of heaven. Sure, Vatican II is not denying it. What Vatican II is saying, those people who do not have the opportunity to receive the sacraments could be given the grace of baptism in an extraordinary way. In a way known only to God. So Vatican II didn't overturn anything here. Now, you also mentioned some things about, that this is dogmatically taught, that the infants must go to hell. I would disagree. There's quite a few theologians who would reiterate the point that this was never taught dogmatically. Limbo was taught as what we would call a common teaching. If you're not familiar with that theological note, all that means is that it is something commonly held by individuals like theologians. It is not something that is binding on anybody. So if there's a theological note of a common teaching, you don't have to believe it. You can disagree with it, and there's no theological censors involved. So again, if you're not familiar with the theological note of common teaching, definitely look it up, and I can include a link at the bottom. But that is what theologians would generally say, is that limbo was never taught definitively. It was taught as a common teaching. So it's going to be on you to establish that these popes, these ecumenical councils, definitively taught the existence of limbo. And even if it did, that's no sweat off my back, because your thesis is that they must go to hell. And I'm saying that they could receive an extra sacramental way of being given the grace of baptism prior to their death.
To try to bring it back to discussion, I just have to jump in here. If
Yeah,
you remember,
I understand, but let me do one other point.
Michael, please. I've been really patient. You had 20 minutes up front. I just want to say this, then you can go on with your rebuttal. I wanted to take this out of the realm of debate, because a lot of what you're saying comes down to, and I apologize if it comes across as uncharitable. I'm trying to think of a nice way of saying it, but it comes across as an academic exercise. You need to prove, you need to prove. I don't really need to prove anything. I want the truth. And the fact is,
according to canon law, you do. Canon law says nothing is to be considered infallible unless it's manifestly established. According to the Catholic Church, you have to show that.
Michael, I'm telling you that if you disagree, that's fine. I'm saying that
canon law disagrees with you.
These are things that the Church, the Catholic Church, has taught historically for hundreds of years. If Catholicism wants to say that in the post-Vatican II era, things are different now, and people have been wrong for hundreds of years, and that the interpretation of these infallible councils are wrong, that's a different discussion. But what you're saying in essence is, let's make this an intellectual argument, which is what I'm really trying to avoid outside of, look, here's the facts. Here's what a parent would do. Here's what a parent would think about today, 100 years ago, 500 years ago in the Catholic Church. So in terms of, can I airtight to a Jesuit standard argue this through? No. And we agreed on this coming in. But as a parent who has 4 miscarried children, if I were Catholic at this moment, I'd want to know, where's my child, and what can I hold on to from a rational perspective? And I admire you. You and I in private chat, you said, even if my child was in hell, it would be brutally hard, but I could accept that. And I admire that, because I have to say that would be enormously hard for me, enormously. I mean, beyond enormous. And I'm talking about in a non-fire sort of hell. But we have to look at this from the standard of, if God is truly loving, if God truly says he desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth, if he also says, you need to be born of water and the Spirit, there has to be a historical way of looking at this that aligns in the Church. And saying that something was true for 1900 years and then, okay, well, we're going to change that now, means that things like birth control and homosexuality and a whole bunch of things that have never been defined in an ecumenical council are now on the table. I will also say that, if I don't want to cross rebut,
but you're kind of taking over my rebuttal.
Well, I know, but I mean, but unfortunately, if I just let you talk,
but that's why we have cross-examination.
Well, I understand, but this is why I told you up front, and I think I was being very honest about this, that you can jump in on me, which you have, and I'm jumping in on you.
Let me jump in here, because you mentioned something just now. Let me, because you just mentioned that something has been taught for 1900 years and now it's being overturned. That's not my position. In fact, the vicarious baptism of desire and the possibility of grace being given to infants that remits their original sin prior to their death is not something in the post-conciliar era only. This was actually taught in the pre-conciliar era, going back to Trent.
Well, then, if you have a reference for that in a binding council, I'd love to see it.
Okay, but what I'm asserting here is that this is just a theological, a common teaching, a theological opinion, in the same way that limbo is a theological opinion.
Okay, and what I'm saying is, here are ecumenical councils. So for Catholics who are out there, if you have statements somewhere in an ecumenical council that says, hey, infant unbaptized can be saved, if you have statements that were broadly accepted, I mean, you raised the commentorium of St. Vincent of Lérins when we were talking earlier. St. Vincent's thing was what's believed all times in all places by all people. That's where the Catholic Church is.
But St. Vincent also recognizes development of doctrine, and that's what's going on here. Now, those ecumenical councils that you're referring to,
Not so
They
much.
aren't excluding what I'm saying. I'm agreeing with you that those ecumenical councils are right when they say if a person dies in a state of original sin, then they're deprived of heaven. I'm agreeing with you. Now, that is entirely irrelevant to what I'm saying. What I'm saying is those councils do not exclude the possibility of an infant being given the grace of baptism prior to their death that would remit their original sin. Those councils do not exclude that. And that's why I belabored the point that number one, you have to show that the council has taught this definitively. And number two, you have to also show that it excludes that position, and it doesn't. They simply don't. And
And
so
again,
your
if
thesis
you can
really
find
doesn't
if you can
hold.
find this theory, which is very new, if you can find this theory
It's
broadly
not.
accepted in Catholicism in the post schism age, I'm open to that. But I'm saying that
Okay,
all the
I'll give you a
documents,
I'll
if you
give you an
not
example.
well, it is, but it's not an example. It's I've shown you a consistent list of how
You
post schism theology. Try to find that in Thomas Aquinas. Try to find it
all
in
right,
any of
you
the popes.
want where this is widely received. How about the liturgy itself? The liturgy itself prays for the souls of unbaptized infants and actually prays that they would be entered into God's kingdom, that they would receive the beatific vision. The liturgy itself, and the liturgy is an expression of the sensus fidei, what the common people believe. The liturgy itself says that they can have the hope. They can hope, they can entrust them to God's mercy, that they would enter into God's kingdom. It doesn't say that they will be in God's kingdom. It also doesn't say that they won't. Now, there's an
Is that
example of
is
something
that
that
is
is
that in the
widely,
the traditional Latin mass?
this is in funeral rite.
I'm sorry,
This is
what
from
right?
the missal funeral rite beginning from 1969 unto the present. Now, if you're
Right.
going to
So
say,
so
well,
right. So it's
now if
another
you're going to
Johnny
say
come
that
lately Vatican
Now,
II
if you're
type thing.
going to argue that, okay, well, I can only use preconciliar liturgical rites, number one, I could point to the Byzantine liturgy that was used in the preconciliar era by Eastern Catholics that does pray for the souls of infants, whether they had baptism or not. Number two, I don't accept the premise that I'm limited to preconciliar liturgies.
And
I
that's
don't
fine.
accept that
You don't
premise.
have to, but that's the same thing I
Yeah.
argue when I argue with Protestants who want to bring everything that's post 1517. If it didn't exist until 1517, it's almost certainly wrong. If it didn't exist until 1960, it's almost certainly wrong. Heresy is just the same thing new under the sun. Again, going back to St. Vincent, everywhere, all times, all
Yeah.
people. If you have a
No,
new
I think
concept, then again, if that's what Catholicism has
it's a new
become, then I'm
concept.
challenging those who are out there to look and say, which church has really held to the apostolic standard? And has Catholicism kind of put itself in a position where it either has to reinforce what it has taught post
Okay.
1054, or does it
Let
have
me
to unwind
challenge
it?
you then. Let me challenge you because you're saying that I'm introducing a new concept. Now, you're saying that it is one can be hopeful that the individual could be in heaven. You're saying you don't know that they're in heaven, but you
Right.
can be hopeful. Now,
Sure.
here, let me throw this right back at you if you want to use St. Vincent of Lawrence. The Eastern Fathers, as a consensus, taught that an unbaptized infant neither receives heaven nor do they go to hell. They did teach that there is this intermediate state. They neither receive reward nor punishment. You can see this in Gregory of Nyssa. You can see this in Nazianzus. You can see this in all of the Eastern Fathers. There's a consensus that they neither go to heaven nor go to hell. Now, what you're telling me is you can hope that they go to heaven. Well, does that mean that you're introducing some kind of new teaching?
No, because
Of
again,
course not.
Catholicism has an infallibility standard. They say that they have the ability to speak infallibly on these topics, excluding
Mhm,
ecumenical councils.
mhm.
No one father is without error, and I know that that will offend some Orthodox out there who believe that every saint
But
will
all
not
the
teach.
Eastern,
Well, wait, I got. No, it isn't all. It's not all, Mike.
all of them taught that.
No,
That is their consensus view.
that is absolutely not true. St. John
That is
Chrysostom did
absolutely
not.
true. I've looked
St. John
into the Eastern
Chrysostom
Fathers
has
on
not
this.
did not teach that. The early fathers, you picked the two who actually taught that the clearest: St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Gregory
What did
Nazianzus.
Chrysostom say?
In fact, Pope St. Gregory the Great explicitly taught that this was not true by virtue of the fact that he talks extensively about Trajan descending into Hades, into hell, and
Irrelevant to
him
my
praying
point.
it out. It's
Okay.
absolutely relevant. It's a pope who prayed someone out
So
of hell,
let's
Michael.
do some cross
Is that
examination and
do you
maybe try to
accept
get this back on track.
do you accept Pope Saint Gregory
Let
the
me
Great?
try to get this
No,
back
no, no,
on
no, no,
track
no, no, no,
because
no, no,
there
no, no, no. Now wait. You had your say. I'm having my say. Do you accept that Pope Saint Gregory the Great is an acceptable source? If it's shown, if you go to look at his dialogues and he prayed someone out of hell, do you accept that? Yes or no?
Sure, and that has absolutely nothing to do with what I'm discussing. I'll accept that, and
It absolutely does,
again,
because
it's
you just said
entirely
the
irrelevant
consensus
to
of
my
of
point
the
here.
Eastern Saints was that, hey, there's nothing going
Gregory
on.
the Great's not an Eastern Saint,
He's
sir.
a Western saint that was accepted by the East,
Exactly.
and the
So
priest gets a
irrelevant to
mirror,
my point.
and the
Thank
priest
you.
gets a mirror when we were all one church.
Irrelevant to my discussion. He's a Western saint. I was talking about Eastern saints. I told you specifically the consensus of the Eastern views. Now let's actually do some cross examination because we're getting off track here. Do you want to start with you asking me 10 minutes or so questions, or me asking you? Either way.
As I said, I want to go back and forth, but it seems like that's not going to be very comfortable. So if you'd like to start, you can, but I'm just not going to be able to respond to 10 minutes of stuff. I'd actually prefer if you just keep it to a minute, then I can respond.
Well,
And
cross
if you want,
examination is where we go back and forth.
okay, then give me what you got.
Mhm.
Give me one thing at a time so I can address it, and I'll do what I can. And I'll tell you what, on the Eastern Saints, I'll punt. And I'll go back and I'll see what else there is. But I know that there are saints who did not accept that. And I know that Chrysostom explicitly talked about heaven for those who died without any stain of sin on their soul. I just have to dig it out because I don't have everything at my
I would like to see
fingertips.
that.
But I will say that if that's your opinion, then that's a pretty
If you
important
could
point.
show that
That's a
to
pretty
me from
important point.
Chrysostom,
I mean, that's a pretty important
that'd
point
be
if it's
excellent.
true. But it's obvious that the
Um,
church was united. I just have to point out that there was not consensus in the saints, as shown by the fact that Rome, and I know you're saying look for Eastern, but that's not how the church works. The church works as one. There
no,
was a
that's
difference of
fine.
opinion. There was a difference of
That's
opinion.
fine.
There was a difference of opinion.
Mhm.
So what questions do you have for me?
If I bring in the Western saints, that hurts your case even more.
How,
So
wait, no,
I was
okay, you
beginning
can't just say that and move on. Why does that hurt my case, Michael?
well, because some of these Western saints from Augustine, Jerome, Fulgentius, they actually believed that they were in the place of the hell of the damned. So that actually hurts your position. That actually says that you could be hopeful that they're in heaven. So if I start to introduce the Western saints,
No,
it actually mitigates that.
no, I need to
hurts your
address
position.
that. Catholicism
Mhm.
thinks, aha, here's a contrary opinion. So as a result, your opinion is invalid. The East Orthodoxy, the church says, no one saint is infallible. So any number of
Understood.
saints have errors on things. St. John Chrysostom
Perfectly fine with that.
believed that
So
Mary was, no, let me finish. St. John Chrysostom believed Mary was sinful. He actually taught that she had sin. Obviously, St. John Chrysostom was incorrect. Even in the West, post-schism, St. Thomas Aquinas said that for at least a moment, Mary had sin. And both East and West reject that concept today. So trying to go back and proof text individual saints, much like proof texting the Bible for Protestants, it's not a rational way of approaching it. We have to look at
the
what did the
only
church actually teach, not what one
I
person in the church taught.
I understand that individual saints can err. My point was that there was a consensus there that is somewhat opposed to what you're saying because you were saying that I'm coming up with something novel and new, and this is contrary to the Vincentian canon. I'm throwing it right back at you and saying, if you hope that they're in heaven, you're going contrary to these Western and Eastern saints that seem to indicate otherwise. And so
But
you
that
have the same problem that I have here, and that's called development of doctrine. That was my only point of bringing it up. My question to you is this.
The Orthodox standard is not the same as the Catholic standard, and that's where we're tripping up here.
The
You just said that
Orthodox
you just said there wasn't consensus by pointing out that some of the Eastern saints said, "Hey, that baby goes to neither a high nor a low place," and then showing that there were other saints who said that those babies suffer in hell. That in
the
and of itself
consensus that they
supports the very
had,
view that I have that says that we don't know what happens to these children because saints have
the
disagreed
consensus
on
that
these things, as opposed to other
can I
topics.
talk here or no?
No, no, you can't because I'm finishing my thought, Michael. Why are you interrupting? Please,
Because
can
you're
I talk?
interrupting me constantly.
You talk for 20 minutes. Now I am getting a little upset.
And you
And
talked for just about as much, if not longer.
I need to be able to answer the question. You bring up something and then you want to move on. That's not how it works. If you bring up something, I have to have the right to address it. The Orthodox standard is that when the saints are in consensus, we agree to it. When the ecumenical council teaches it, we adhere to it. If saints disagree, then it's a matter of theological opinion. And you have just proven the Orthodox view that this is a matter of theological opinion. You had disagreements between West and East. That's all I want to say. Now you can say your piece.
I would say that the consensus actually is definitely slanted against your position, which is why I was saying that you also have to go with a development of doctrine view here. That was my only point of bringing them up. My question to you is, does an ecumenical council, anything that an ecumenical council teaches, is it always infallible?
Sorry, I was
According
reading
to Roman Catholicism. According to Roman Catholicism, when an ecumenical council teaches something, is it always infallible? According to Roman Catholicism.
I don't know how to answer that question, so I'll punt.
Well, I'll give you the answer. The answer is no. The ecumenical council
Well,
can
if
teach
you
with what's called the authentic magisterium,
okay,
which is
so
not necessarily infallible.
okay.
So my point in bringing that up is you continue to appeal to Florence and Lyons and other ecumenical councils and say and give this idea that, well, if the ecumenical council says it, then it's infallible. But I just showed you that that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, but you're being disingenuous here, Michael. There's no discussion of this
How's that?
as being something that people have any question about. Do you deny that the statements of the first, second, and ecumenical councils are infallible? Are you saying, hey, we could go back and be Arian again, or we could go back and be monothelite again? I'll
No,
answer
because
my question.
Nicaea definitively taught that Christ is homoousios with the Father. So I'm making a distinction between what the ecumenical council teaches definitively between what an ecumenical council can teach with the authentic magisterium, but not definitively or infallibly. I have enough nuances to understand that, hey, an ecumenical council can teach some things definitively and some things not definitively. You don't seem to have that nuance. You seem to think that as long as an ecumenical council taught it, it's definitive, which you're going to have some problems with the first 7 ecumenical councils in that case.
Well, this is
So,
why I said that we're getting into debate standards again. I'm not going to say that every single statement and every single council is
that's a cop
infallible.
out.
No, it's not a cop out. But Michael,
It is.
nobody can look at the statements
You're
of
the
the
one
council
making
that I put up
assertions,
there
and then I'm
and say,
showing you the
yes, I am.
assertions are incorrect.
Yes, I am making assertions because everybody looked at this and took it one way for hundreds of years. And what you're saying is that's the same as a statement in an ecumenical council that says, don't go to a Jewish doctor under pain of sin. You're equating those two, and it's not fair, and it's not honest at all. If you want to address this and say that those statements have the same binding as any other statement in a council, then you have to go back and say, well, you know what? Maybe we misunderstood Arianism or monophysitism or iconoclasm. But you won't.
That's not
Just
true
for those
because
councils.
I recognize the distinction between what an ecumenical council teaches definitively and what it doesn't. And I don't appreciate you saying that I'm being dishonest here. Now you're starting to use ad hominems against me instead of what I'm actually saying. So I don't appreciate that. The other point I want to say is I have no problem with what these ecumenical councils are teaching. Yes, if a person dies in a state of original sin, then they're deprived of the beatific vision. That's irrelevant to my point here. My point is they can be given the grace of baptism in an extraordinary way. And the Catholic Church teaches that and has left open that possibility in these ecumenical councils all the way to the present, and in its ordinary magisterium teaches that you can have that hope that God can give them the grace in an extraordinary way so that they don't die in a state of original sin. Those ecumenical councils were dealing with the assertion that if you do die in a state of original sin, again, irrelevant to my point. So I'm not really even sure if you're grasping that distinction. Do you understand that what I'm saying is that a person can have their original sin removed in an extraordinary way, and that's not what those ecumenical councils were addressing?
I don't think that I understand what you're saying. What I'm saying is that it's a creation of an intellectual exercise when the plain meaning of the text and the understanding was not that there's going to be an extraordinary way to save these children when it is said again and again, and the ideas are anathematized. You said nothing was anathematized at Florence, and that's just not true. I don't know.
I didn't say nothing was anathematized at Florence, sir. That's not what I said.
Okay, let me rephrase it since you're trying to be precise. You said there were no anathema statements regarding baptism at Florence. You said that earlier in the discussion.
What I said is the parts that you're quoting at Florence, there are no anathemas attached to it. no canons and no anathemas and no definitive language. I might personally believe that the Council of Florence taught it definitively, but you have to establish that, and you haven't established that. You have to show that it has taught that.
Okay.
And you're just
Canon,
saying, well,
canon,
since an
can,
ecumenical council says it, it's definitive. And I'm saying that's not good enough, because that's not how it works in Catholicism.
okay, fair enough. Canon 5 of Trent, if anyone says that baptism is optional, let him be anathema. Not necessary for
Absolutely. You
salvation.
must baptize a person. That now the point is baptism in an extraordinary way. We're not saying that any infant goes to heaven without baptism. The question now is, can that infant receive baptism outside of water baptism? Can they receive the graces of baptism to go to heaven outside of water touching them and the Trinitarian formula being said over them? That's what we're talking about. Can
Uh,
the Council of Trent is not addressing that.
Okay. I mean, I'm open to that. What counsels do you have that show that this baptism can occur in an extraordinary way? Because maybe then you're onto
Well,
something there
here's
that
my assertion. My assertion is not that the Catholic Church has ever dogmatically or definitively taught that they do go to heaven. My assertion is the ordinary magisterium of the Catholic Church has taught that we can have hope that they go to heaven, because perhaps through some kind of extraordinary means, it doesn't define it, perhaps through God giving them vicarious baptism of desire, perhaps baptism of blood, whatever theory you want to throw out, the Catholic Church says you can have hope that their original sin has been remitted. You can have hope, but not assurance. You can't know that their original sin has been remitted, but you also can't know that it hasn't been remitted. They could be in this place of limbo. They could be in heaven. It could be that some are in limbo and some are in heaven, but the ordinary magisterium teaches that you can have that hope. The instruction on baptism of children, 1980, teaches that, and that's part of the magisterium. And again, it's the ordinary magisterium. And also Evangelium Vitae by John Paul II teaches that we can have hope that God would give them this necessary grace to enter into heaven. So, and that doesn't take away from what Florence and these other councils were saying, because what they were saying is, if you die in a state of original sin, then you're deprived of the beatific vision. What Evangelium Vitae and what the instruction on infant baptism in 1980 are saying is that it is possible God could give them that baptism in an extraordinary way. And that is taught by the ordinary magisterium. So this would be something that is just part of the authentic magisterium. It's not definitively taught, but it has also never been definitively taught that an infant does die in a state of original sin. Catholic Church has never taught that. That has been the view of some. As I mentioned this before, that was a common theological opinion of some. But as I told you already, a common theological opinion has a theological note of, that's just an opinion. It's a theological opinion that you are free to accept or reject. Simple as that. So the Catholic Church has never said that they actually must die in this state, as you're asserting. The Catholic Church actually opens up and says, no, it's possible that they could be given the necessary graces to not die in a state of original sin. So in my opinion, the debate and thesis has been disproven,
Okay.
because
So
I
you're
have
saying that
showed you the
there
ordinary
are actual
magisterium.
exceptions to baptism, is what you're saying for
Well, you
salvation.
believe that there's exceptions to baptism too. I mean, you know perfectly well the church fathers taught baptism of water, blood, and desire. Now, you can see multiple popes in the preconciliar era saying that baptism of desire can be implicit. So in other words, you can be joined to the Catholic Church. You don't have to have
Michael, you're
formal
talking about
membership
people
according
who
to.
have an act of the will. I'm
You
saying
are right.
for
We are
babies.
talking about
So what
we are
about for
talking about
babies?
people. Absolutely. I agree with you. Those popes were talking, when they spoke about implicit desire baptism, they're talking about people who have the age of reason. I 100% agree with you. They're not talking about, infants who don't have the ability to reason. No doubt.
Okay. No,
But
no,
the
no. What to
principle,
calm it down a little bit? Do you have something? Because I would super be interested in this. My whole family's Catholic. Do you have something that says, "Hey, look, it's not baptism of desire, it's not baptism of blood, but there's a baptism of something else, but that the church has shown that infants can be saved through this baptism of I don't even know what to call it. Do you have something
I
on that?
have Gaudium et Spes 22 that says in a way known to God. I have Evangelium Vitae that says that we can entrust them to God's mercy. And I have the funeral rite of the liturgy that also says that we can hope and pray that they are given the kingdom of heaven. And I also have the instruction on infant baptism 1980 that says that we can entrust them to God's mercy. My point is, we don't know how that's done. I'm offering some theories on how that could be. And one of those theories is vicarious baptism of desire, baptism of blood. You're free to accept or reject those theories. And my point doesn't even stand or fall on them, because all my point is, in some way known only to God, it is possible that God remits their original sin. What way? I don't know. I can offer some possibilities as I've just given, but in some way only known to God. We don't know is the answer here. And that's actually your position too. You believe that
Oh,
the
no,
Orthodox Church teaches
I think
we
we're in
don't know.
I think
And
we're in
that's what the
violent.
Catholic
I
Church
think
teaches
we're in
too.
violent agreement in the trenches. I mean, that's what's really amusing to me
Yeah,
overall.
we agree here that we don't know. The Catholic
I think
Church
we
teaches
agree.
the exact same thing. Yeah, the Catholic Church teaches the same thing. It doesn't say that we know that they are deprived of the beatific vision. It actually just says we don't know. It could be, it could not be. We have reasons for hope, but nobody can presume upon God's grace. So we're actually in agreement here. When it comes to this issue at a practical perspective, although I would have some challenges for you, because you have the Council of 1672, which the four patriarchs signed off of, that teaches that infants actually go to hell and suffer
Jerusalem, right.
eternal punishments. And this is
Right,
taught by the Eastern Orthodox Church.
but not an ecumenical council. Just like
I agree.
there are local councils of Catholicism that I know Orthodox bring up, and I go, you can't bring those up. They're local
Sure,
councils. Everyone acknowledges you can make
sure.
a mistake in a local council. So,
Here's a
and that's a
question I
fair,
have
and
for
that's a
you
fair
about
point.
that, though.
And that's a fair point. I mean, Jerusalem is a great example of some teachings that are very eye-opening if you've never seen them before.
Then I have a question for you. Is Palimism something you are free to reject in Eastern Orthodoxy?
I am not an expert here. The answer is no, but I can't give you a good reason as to
You're
why.
correct.
Those
The
are,
answer is no. Was Palimism taught by an ecumenical council or only local councils in Constantinople?
and again, I'm going to have to punt, Michael. You're going to know more about this.
Only local councils.
No, no, no.
It
Well, I'm
was
just saying,
only taught.
rather than you give a one-sided view, I would just ask in the sense of
So
charity, bring on an Orthodox guy, bring on Father Josiah. You're going to bring him on. He can talk about it all day long. That was not
here's my
that was
point.
not what drove me into Orthodoxy. It was this salvation issue. So I know this
But
issue very well. You know the
here's my point.
essence issue. You can talk that one out.
For the sake of consistency here, Palimism was taught by local churches, a local church, a local council in the Church of Constantinople. Okay, but now I do believe it's definitive for Eastern Orthodox. Don't get me wrong, but that's because it was received by the local Orthodox churches. Now, Jerusalem 1672 was also received by the local Orthodox churches. So my thing is, how are you free to reject 1672, but you're telling me that you accept Palimism? I mean, it's
Can't
one or the other,
can't answer
unless
it
you're able to make
because
some other
since
distinctions.
I'm not a theologian and I didn't prepare for 1672, I can't talk to it. I've read it. It was part of what I read
Mhm.
along with a whole bunch of local councils before becoming Orthodox. But again, the standard
Yeah, I will only bring it
we
up.
have we have to make sure that we're using the same standards. Catholicism says
Sure.
if it's taught in a definitive manner by the Pope, one guy,
Mhm.
it's binding. And I want to, and I'm not trying to create problems, but like, do we both agree that birth control is absolutely wrong and cannot be unwound, even though it's not been defined at an ecumenical council? Or would you disagree with that? If you agree with it, fine. If you disagree, we can move on.
I think you can make a very good case that the use of artificial contraceptions has been weighed against it. It is condemned by the ordinary and universal magisterium,
Okay.
not by an
I thought,
ecumenical council,
no, I got it.
not
I
by an
just thought,
ex-officio statement.
right. And I thought maybe we could just have like common cause
Yeah,
to say that it doesn't take an ecumenical council for the Pope to declare
I
something that
agree.
needs to be obeyed by a Catholic. You can't just say,
Sure.
well, the Pope hasn't ecumenically defined birth control or homosexuality,
Right.
so we're fine with it. I think that would be a
I
wrong
agree.
way of approaching it. Orthodox standard
Sure.
would be a little bit different in that even if a patriarch says something like, say, Nestorius, um, he was still wrong, even though he was the patriarch. Even
Mhm.
though Pope Honorius was wrong with respect to what he taught, the rest of the church eventually, for the lack of a better term, got it right. And so
Mhm.
it's just a different standard, collegiality versus
Sure, yeah.
top down, which, by the
We're
way,
in agreement here.
yeah, so I get
Eastern
it.
Orthodoxy has a different teaching understanding. It has a different way of identifying what is definitive than Roman Catholicism. I agree with you,
By the
and
way,
that is no.
I'm looking at the chat, and just real quickly, I forgot because again, I'm relatively new to Orthodoxy. I don't know everything. I normally say there are 7 ecumenical councils in Orthodoxy. It's commonly said among Russians, especially, that there are 9, because there are 2 other councils that are not called Orthodox or ecumenical because Rome wasn't there, but which are universally accepted. And Palimism is in one of those. I can't remember if it's the 8th or the 9th.
Well,
So that's
yeah, I mean, you're referring to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, but the thing is, it actually did not define the essence and energies distinction. I believe in the essence and energies distinction. I agree with it, but I do not say that the Sixth Ecumenical Council defined it. It you could read it in a way that you would say it's making that distinction, and you could also read it in a way that it's not making that distinction. But the context of what was actually going on there is that they weren't really making that distinction. That wasn't being
Well,
defined.
I could be
But
wrong, but I'd be interested in hearing you talk about it later. But my understanding was that Aquinarian theology explicitly, and from what I've read, seemed to
no,
explicitly condemn
no,
energy essence in favor of absolute
no,
divine simplicity.
no, no.
So,
I mean, that's yeah. I mean, that's a whole nother discussion which we could do. I mean, if you want me to respond to that, I
no,
can.
no, it's okay. I mean, I'm sure you'll have
Yeah.
I really think Father Josiah, when he comes on, you two will have a really good talk about it because he'll understand the
Mhm,
filioque, he'll understand energy essence. He can talk to those
mhm.
things, but as a father of 7, I don't have time to look at everything. As I said, my
Sure.
standard, right or
No, I
wrong,
hear you.
was if Catholicism teaches even one thing that's incorrect dogmatically, I'm out. And so
Mhm.
that's where I ended up. So,
No, and I agree with you. I agree. If an ecumenical council teaches something definitively and it's incorrect, that's a deal breaker. No doubt
Is it
about it.
is it if it's a loaded question, punt on it, because I admit I got a little hot earlier. I apologize for being uncharitable, but I'm just curious. Do you see anything in Vatican II, any of the
Mhm,
statements, as being contradictory to the earlier councils? Because I don't see a way around that for some of the statements, but and I've read a lot of the
mhm,
things, but I'm not a theologian. I'm happy to listen to your
mhm.
perspective on it, like the statements
No,
on
it's a good
religious
question.
liberty or things like that. Does that?
Right, no, right. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I've read all documents, 16 documents of the Second Vatican Council, and then some of the other documents surrounding them, discussing their theological weight. I've also studied a lot about the history behind it, what was going on, behind the scenes. So, I would say that the council itself, there's nothing in the council itself, the actual text, that must be understood in a way that is contrary to what was previously held by the perennial magisterium. There are some things in there that could be read in that way, sure, but you also have Nicaea 1 where that could easily be misunderstood. The term homoousios was used by heretics. I mean, this was used by Arians and Gnostics. So it was actually condemned in the year 250 by the Church of Antioch. So it could be
You're
misunderstood,
referring to similar versus same substance, that whole thing.
Right. So the term homoousios was actually initiated by Gnostics and heretics, but they meant that term in a heretical way, whereas Nicaea meant that term in a positive and orthodox and correct way. But if you aren't paying attention to those distinctions, you could easily misread Nicaea. And in the same way, if you're not paying attention to certain distinctions going on in Vatican II, you could easily misread it. I would say that Vatican II is open to a lot of criticism, not because it taught something contrary to the faith, but because it taught it in such a way that left it very ambiguous to where it was deliberately actually written in an ambiguous way that would open it up to misinterpretation. So I wouldn't say there are any formal contradictions in Vatican II from the perennial magisterium, but I would say that there are things that are poorly expressed, if we could put it that way. Sure.
Okay. So you would say Vatican II is an ecumenical council or is not?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Okay. Thanks.
Mhm, mhm.
And I
So,
think you have time to ask me some stuff because I kind of yeah, jumped in there.
well, We're talking about Vatican II here. It sounded like I may have misheard you, but did you say that a Catholic has to reject Vatican II if they're going to be consistent? I may have misunderstood something that you said. Well, is that your position that a Catholic, if they want to be consistent, they have to reject Vatican II
Um,
when it comes to the topic of
I mean, I think
unbaptized
that's.
infants?
I think to rip off a meme, no, but actually yes. The problem with Vatican II is if you once again, I'm using a non-syllogistic view. I'm looking at Catholicism and saying, let's pretend that I was a Catholic born any time between the year 1000 and the year 1950. My parents were born in 1928, and you have this corpus of knowledge taught by Thomas Aquinas, reaffirmed by a bunch of very bright and brilliant theologians, saints of the Catholic Church. And then you get up to the 60s, and statements
Mhm.
are made defending the right to religious liberty, for example. The right to worship in an erroneous way is defended as a right, or making statements that seem to suggest salvation is available to those who in the past the church has explicitly um, said no, this is not possible. So what I think your argument is, well, Al, you're looking at it wrong. They're just written poorly, and if I'm putting words in your mouth, correct me. They're just written poorly. They're not really contradictory. They're just written poorly. I look at them and I go, I don't know how any individual who had been taught up to this point in time can do anything other than a lot of people of my parents' generation did and looked and said, "Oh, Vatican II changed all that." And that, whatever the answer is, I think we would both agree that is not an acceptable answer to Catholics. You can't say Vatican II changed something that was taught
Mhm.
for hundreds of years under pain of going to hell, and it's like, well, it's
Mhm.
okay now. And I want to be clear: this
Sure.
is not about disciplines. The church has the right to make it a mortal sin to eat meat on Friday under Catholic teaching, and then remove that
Mhm.
discipline. This is not a discipline thing. This is a
Yeah.
whatever the right word is, doctrine dogma thing. So I want to be
Yeah.
clear,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
in case somebody says, "Oh, you're saying we can't change,
No.
Lenten disciplines or married priests or anything." No, you can change all that. You have the right to do that. Your church can change that. But what they can't change is things that this is the truth and this is the truth for all time. And I
Mhm.
I don't believe that Vatican II is consistent with the other 22 ecumenical councils of the church. That
I
would be
agree with you that the church cannot overturn anything that was previously taught definitively, but I don't think that the Second Vatican Council actually did that at any point. If you could maybe show me where it did that, I would love it. The examples that you gave, I would not agree with them. I've looked at them in depth. I wouldn't say that they turned over anything that was definitive, but I would agree with you that there's a way in which you could read them in that way. Sure, absolutely. But then there's a lot of good counter arguments that would say, that's not necessarily the absolute way that you have to read this thing. So
okay.
let me ask you this. Can the authentic magisterium err? Because I get the impression you're saying it cannot. Are you saying that it can or cannot?
Again, because you're using terms that you're used to using and I'm not, I'm going to have to punt and ask for another question.
Well,
Rather
let me
than
just
rather than
clarify
try
what
to
I mean by that. Let me
well, I
clarify that.
understand, but rather than, if you don't mind, if you have other questions, because otherwise you'll talk another few minutes and I won't get a chance really to address any issues that you may have, and I really, really want to do that, if you don't mind. If you really feel like you have to, Michael, go ahead, but I just would like
No,
the chance to at least address some of your issues that maybe you've got a list of or something.
absolutely. Let me ask one more, and then you maybe just ask me some questions. You wrote an article, I want to say in 2018. I'm definitely going to put it at the bottom in the link here so that everybody can read it. And in there, you say that when a pope uses the quote standard Catholic formula of declare, say, define, and pronounce, then it's ex cathedra. Where did you get that from?
I think it's pretty much self-apparent. If it's not, then what purpose does it mean to be a pope that is going to declare, define for the entire church? As you're well aware, there's three standards for ex cathedra. If he's just saying this in a private conversation to one other guy, then I agree. It doesn't matter. If you're writing
Mhm,
in a letter, in an encyclical that's going to the entire Catholic world, you mean it to be public, you mean it to be for the whole church, and you mean it to be binding. Otherwise, why
mhm,
would you use that particular formulation? I mean, I
mhm,
get it in a certain sense. I guess the counter question to you would be, if you disagree, I'd like a list of the ex cathedra statements of the Catholic Church, because if we
Sure.
can't get that, then as somebody who is a father and has to teach my children, and remember, until
Mhm.
2015, I was teaching my children, you need to follow all the ex cathedra statements of the church. Well, Dad, what are
Mhm.
those? Well, anytime that a pope has said something publicly and says this is for everyone, not just for the Western Church, not just for the Eastern rites, not just for the Melkites or the
Right.
Maronites, it's for
Right.
everybody. And we define,
Right.
solemnly pronounce, that's kind of, I mean, you have to really try hard to
Mhm.
struggle against the plain meaning of he means this to be followed. This isn't an optional thing. You can't go to
Yeah.
Humanae Vitae and wiggle out of it because the Pope didn't say this is ex cathedra.
Mhm.
It's binding. Artificial birth control condemnation is binding in the Catholic Church. So that's why I
I
keep
think you
going
could
back
make
to
a good case that it is by the ordinary and universal magisterium. Now, no, I'm glad you mentioned that and you clarified because in your article, it doesn't seem that you gave those qualifications, but here you're giving some additional qualifications that, okay, if they meet the description of Vatican I. So it's not just if they say we define, we decree, but also this is for the entire universal church to be held definitively. So I'm glad that you're adding those qualifications because the paper itself leaves those out. And so you're saying
right, because
this actually
there
was.
aren't a whole lot of instances where a pope says, "I solemnly declare,
Mhm.
define, promote," but only means it as a private matter. In fact, I'm not even aware of any. So instead of making my
Mhm.
paper a 30 page long thesis that no one will read, it's kind of a shorthand for yes, there is
Yeah.
a definition that goes behind this. If I don't think
You,
the pope has ever declared anything just for the Eastern Church, but if he had, then that would define just for the Eastern Church, dogmatically. I mean, as opposed to
mhm.
disciplines. There are all sorts of disciplines for the Eastern Church.
Well, I also bring it up because in the paper you're saying the Pope taught this ex cathedra, but then when you look at the actual statement, it doesn't meet the description of an ex cathedra teaching according to Vatican I. They may have used the term define, but they did not use the other conditions that Vatican I gives. And so I would take issue with how you understand what is ex cathedra. It seems
Are,
to
are
me
you
that you're not
talking
making
about
some distinction.
Cantate Domino, Eugene the Fourth statement?
Cantate Domino is a perfect example. Where does it say we decree, we define in the context of what we're discussing here when it comes to those who die in the stage of original sin? It doesn't. It doesn't say that.
That one says that believes, professes, and preaches, and so
Yeah,
as
exactly.
right, and so to me that is the same
Mhm.
as it's slightly different wording, but it's the same
Okay.
concept that I can't imagine anyone
Mhm.
reading that and saying this is optional. Do you think
Hey,
that?
look,
I mean, do you think that that could be optional?
I get what you're saying that okay, he's effectively saying the same thing, but as I noted, there are other conditions of Vatican I that they have to meet that Cantato Domini does not meet. Now, if you're asking my personal opinion on Cantato Domini and Florence, I think that what they're expressing is definitive.
Oh no, I don't
I
mean your
actually
personal
believe that
opinion.
it's
I
definitive.
mean, do you believe that a Catholic can read Florence or Trent or Cantate
Mhm,
Domino or Vatican One and say, well, I don't really see it in this particular way? In other words, is papal infallibility from Vatican One on the table as a potential thing? I mean, it's kind of like a meta thing, right? You need papal to declare papal infallibility to get it, but given especially the huge resistance of certain subgroups of bishops, is papal infallibility something on the table in terms of, well, it probably is part of the ordinary magisterium, but it's not definitively absolutely binding on the faithful?
uh, maybe I'm not understanding you correctly here. Break it down for me again, because I don't
Sure,
think I'm
sure,
following you.
sure. And again, I can get emotional about this. I have 4 children that I want to be in heaven. So in other words, when I look at something, I'm trying to look at it from the lens of the truth, right? So the way I was
Mhm,
brought up as a Catholic is, look, not everything that the Pope says is right. If Pope Francis
mhm,
spouts off on something, you don't have to sit there and leave Catholicism. There are bad popes. There are things that they're bad people.
mhm,
It doesn't matter
mhm.
insofar as that goes. Okay, fine. But if you're
Yeah.
writing an encyclical, if you're writing something at especially
Mhm.
an ecumenical council, now the standards have been
Yeah.
raised substantially. And if you're writing
Sure.
about something dogmatic at an ecumenical
Mhm,
council, at that point,
mhm,
you don't really get to choose anymore. That's part of your faith. So if Vatican I says, and I can't remember
mhm,
the wording offhand, but essentially it defines what we today call papal infallibility and gives the standards that you've talked
mhm.
about. Um, there's not really, as far as I can tell, a Catholic way of saying, you know what, I get it. A lot of people think that that's infallible, that statement,
Hmm.
but maybe it's not. It doesn't say exactly what you think it does. And in fact, I've
Yeah.
had a lot of people say that. Um, Again, as a Catholic, I said I'm not seeing that. And the same thing for these other pre-Vatican I councils. Once a statement is made on a dogmatic issue and is stated
Hmm.
very directly and clearly, and not just on infant baptism, any number of things,
Hmm.
um, they're done for, is what I'm saying. And I think
Okay.
what you're saying, which is kind of nice because it's enlightened me in a way I haven't seen a Catholic look at this before, is look, very, very few statements, even in an ecumenical council, are really dogmatically binding. They can
Hmm.
be, they probably are, but even like birth control, you can't say that that is absolutely positively ex cathedra dogmatically binding. You feel pretty comfortable it is, but that's real different than saying no. If you think artificial birth control is okay, that's mortally sinful. You're definitely going to hell if you use it.
All right. Let me respond to that. I think this is an excellent question because I think it's getting at some of the things that we're failing to distinguish here. I'm not trying to be an attorney here by using all these distinctions. I'm trying to, it was Saint Maximus, actually, in the 7th century. Maximus the Confessor, who says that if we don't make proper distinctions, we're going to fall into all kinds of errors. So here's why I'm making these distinctions when it comes to the magisterium, because I think that you're going to end up falling into misunderstandings, such as some of the ones that, in my opinion, you've done, because some of these distinctions aren't being grasped. Sorry, grasped. So let me give some examples. And by the way, just to answer your question, you're asking me, okay, the standards that Vatican I gave, if a council taught, or if the Pope taught something according to those standards, are we free to disagree with them? No. If a Pope teaches under the conditions that Vatican I gives, it is definitive, it's ex cathedra. My point was, Florence does not meet those conditions of Vatican I. Now, if you want to show me that it actually meets the conditions of Vatican I, that's great, but I don't think that you can demonstrate that. I
It's a
don't think that
slightly
it
it's a
does.
slightly different question. What I'm saying is, how do you know that the statements of Vatican I themselves
Hmm.
are dog? Or do you know that? And I'm guessing based on what you said, we really don't know. It's kind of like Protestants use the example of a fallible collection of infallible books for the Bible because they don't have a church, an infallible church to define what the books are, and that's the statement that was commonly used with me. It's a fallible collection of infallible books.
How do we
So
know that Vatican I is infallible? Is that what you're asking me?
right. So in other words, do we know that? Because if you're using the standard of these other councils as saying, well, they're probably correct, they're probably part of the magisterium, but we don't know for sure, then that same standard has to go to the statement of Vatican I itself, especially knowing the backdrop of the council where there was a significant disagreement. The Melkite bishops, I mean, basically left in disgust. It doesn't mean that they have veto rights or anything under the Catholic schema.
Mhm.
It just means that someone could look at that and say, well, obviously, this was a council of the West and it wasn't a universal council, which I've heard a lot from Melkites, who
Mhm.
most Melkites will reject papal infallibility. In fact, I'd say the vast majority of them, I bet, do. So,
I, Yeah, let me say something here. I think that your question is a non-starter because it fails to grasp what we would call different theological weights in the magisterium. Just because the magisterium teaches something in a non-definitive way doesn't mean it doesn't carry some authority. So, an ecumenical council, when it teaches something, even if it's not definitive, even if it's not teaching something definitive, it still carries a lot more weight than, let's say, a pope just writing a letter to somebody. There's different gradations and different theological weights that we would give to, for example, a papal bull versus a papal encyclical, or an ecumenical council's constitution versus an ecumenical council's decree. There is different levels of weight there. So even when it comes to non-infallible teachings by these organs of the magisterium, doesn't mean we're just free to oppose them either. So I would say that we have to be careful to differentiate between the different theological weights that are being used. And also make note of the fact that an ecumenical council can teach some things definitively, and then it can also use lower levels of the magisterium to teach something that is ordinarily binding, but is not necessarily definitive. It could be reformed later on. So
Okay.
as long as we understand the way the magisterium works and these proper distinctions, then we won't fall into these problems that I think that you're
No, no,
giving
no, I got
expression
it.
to.
But the papal infallibility teaching itself of Vatican I, therefore,
Yeah.
it by its definition, while it carries heavy weight, would be
Hmm.
in your mind, I think, and again, if I'm misrepresenting you, would be kind of on the same level as like a Florence or Lateran or Lyon, in that we have to give it very serious consideration. But
No,
that would mean
no,
that the Melkites who say, "Hey, this
no.
is the Council of the West,"
It's not what I'm saying.
we can kind of work beyond it.
No, and this is why in my opening statement I was trying to give some of these examples because I think we're still failing to grasp some things here. Vatican I uses canons and anathemas against those who deny papal infallibility. So the use of canons and anathemas is a very good signal that something is taught definitively. You would have to really show for really good cause that when an ecumenical council teaches a matter of faith and morals with the use of canons and anathemas, that it's you can go ahead and believe that this is infallible. You'd have to make a really strong case to show otherwise. Now, what I'm saying is some things that are taught in Florence, like the things that you've brought up, do not have canons attached to that particular part. They do not have anathemas attached to that particular part. They don't even have definitive language in some cases. And so my point in differentiating between Vatican I and Florence here is you have the use of a canon, you have the use of an anathema in Vatican I, whereas you don't have that with what we're discussing here with Florence. Now, elsewhere, Florence used canons and anathemas on different teachings. But this is why I said an ecumenical council can teach different things with different theological weights, with different degrees of authority, with different degrees of something being binding. So not everything taught by an ecumenical council has to be definitive, but that also doesn't say that now, hey, Arianism is back in the picture. No, because Nicaea definitively ruled against that. So we can differentiate between what is taught definitively and what is not taught definitively by an ecumenical council. And from what I've seen in this debate so far, and also with your article, you're not making those distinctions. And that's why you're coming to this conclusion that, in my opinion, is incorrect. So I would suggest perhaps looking further into how the magisterium works, differentiating between magisterial weights, and also determining how do we know when something is taught ex cathedra? How do we know when an ecumenical council is speaking definitively? And how do we know when it's not? That's something that I think that we should look further into. We're right at 1 hour and 45 minutes. I know we're up against the clock here. If y'all want to go ahead and start sending some chat questions, we're more than happy to take some. Al, you can take any that you've seen so far. I might grab a couple, but let me give you a chance to maybe give any kind of concluding thoughts that you wanted to before you go to some of the chat questions. If you want to, you don't have to.
Sure. Well, like I said, today's goal for me was not debate, but really more to chat. I know that debate is more of the style of the show, and I hope others can come on who are more theologically oriented than me and can maybe go into the nitty-gritty detail. My thing is that if Catholicism truly teaches that those who die without baptism can be saved, and we're focusing just on the unbaptized infants at this point. I do believe that the broader teaching of Catholicism is actually well beyond that. Then that's great. That would mean that Orthodoxy and Catholicism are aligned in that belief. I will say that the historical evidence appears to be quite the contrary. That burial was denied to children pre-Vatican II, and actually post-Vatican II. My own miscarried child. Um, he was not supposed to be buried. We ended up burying them. The bishop gave approval for that because those who die without baptism, whether it is the actual sacramental baptism or what's known as extra sacramental baptism, baptism of blood or desire, are outside the church. And for me, it comes down to just a very practical argument. One, is it true? If these children are in hell, then we need to accept it, whether we like it or not. That's really what it comes down to. That would be incredibly grieving, but truth is the primary and overwhelming consideration here. whatever else we have. That said, if the truth is something a little bit different than what is being taught on either side, then those sides need to adjust to reflect that. My baptismal name is Varus. This is a pre-schism saint. He saved a unbaptized person, John, the son of Saint Cleopatra, who's now known as Saint John. While I'm saying, well, Michael would say, well, look, Al, you're missing the point again. I'm not so much missing the point that it can't happen under the Catholic structure. What I'm saying is that I just can't agree with it in good nature, because everything that has been taught, everything that is out there, the documentation, the Denzinger quotes, there is nothing that states, hey, look, we can have good hope for the salvation of those who die without baptism. In fact, that particular statement I just made, that you can have good hope for those who die without baptism, has been anathematized. I don't have chapter and verse. Maybe there's a Catholic out there or an Orthodox guy who can get it, but that was one of the ones that really smacked me across the face when I was looking at, my own kids passing away. So that's probably the end statement I have. Let's all look into what actually the truth is, and let's march together in truth together. And I guess I'll just turn it over to you, Michael. That's all I wanted from this. And so I got a little bit of an understanding of how someone like you, who's very well versed in Catholicism, could kind of look at this and say, well, yes, there's some very clear, definitive, I probably, can't work my way around it. And yet there's still kind of some mystical, and maybe mystical is the wrong word. I don't know what the right word is. I'll stick with mystical and you can correct it. Some mystical way in which the baptism can be imputed to an unborn or miscarried or below the age of reason child that would allow them to not just go to hell, but to enter heaven.
Fair enough. No, and you coming on. This was an excellent discussion. I really enjoyed it. Just to kind of conclude my position, I think that if we want to say that what was taught by Florence and Lyons and others was definitive, that still is entirely irrelevant to the fate of unbaptized infants, because all those teachings were saying is that if a person dies in a state of original sin, then they're deprived of the beatific vision. But we're now asking the question, must they die in a state of original sin? And as I've demonstrated, no, we don't have to say that they must. It could be that they do. It could be that some do and some don't. Could be that none die in a state of original sin, and God gives everyone extra sacramental graces of baptism. It's entirely left up to God in an extraordinary way to do however he wants and however he sees fit with his grace. So I would say the thesis doesn't hold, because no, the Catholic Church does not teach this dogmatically. And even if it does speak dogmatically, it only speaks about those who die in a state of original sin dogmatically. It's not speaking about whether or not infants can be given this extra sacramental grace. I've given multiple examples of instances in which some people thought that there could be an extra sacramental grace or means of grace given to infants to remit their original sin. Historically, I mentioned Cajetan, but I actually want to mention Aquinas. Let me read something from Aquinas. He says, and this is from his Summa Theologia, children while in the mother's womb have not yet come forth into the world to live among other men. Consequently, they cannot be subject to the action of man so as to receive the sacrament at the hands of man unto salvation. They can, however, be subject to the action of God, in whose sight they live, so as by any kind of privilege to receive the grace of sanctification, as was the case with those who were sanctified in the womb. So what Aquinas is saying here is that all we have as humans is the sacrament of baptism. We have no other way of bringing salvation to an individual. We are bound to the sacraments, but God is not bound to the sacraments, as Augustine and Aquinas taught. God is not bound to them. He is able to give them the grace of salvation in an extraordinary way. And this is a principle right here affirmed by Aquinas, and he's speaking in the context of infants in their mother's womb. So this isn't individuals who have reached the age of reason. He's saying God is able to save even these people who are in their mother's womb. I would say that, Aquinas, if he had teased that out further, he could have really, spoken about this further and really applied it to how this works with infants and original sin and being unbaptized and dying in that state. He didn't tease it out a whole lot, but again, the principle is there. So what I'm saying is not novel. You can find this in Aquinas. This is in the preconciliar era. This is in Cayetan and many others. So, you can also see Dr. Ludwig Ott in the preconciliar era, who mentions, though it is definitively taught in his estimation that if somebody dies in a state of original sin, they're deprived of the beatific vision, it's still a perfectly legitimate possibility that their original sin can be remitted in an extra sacramental way. That comes from Ludwig Ott. So here you have an example of somebody who believed what was taught by Florence and all that was definitive, and yet that doesn't negate the possibility of an extra sacramental means of grace being given to these infants before they die. So that's pretty much what I would like to say in conclusion. For that reason, I don't think the thesis that was offered here holds. I don't see any questions. A fan in the chat. Let me search through here. Al, do you see any that you wanted to answer for you?
I try to answer them on the fly where I could. If anybody has a question for Michael or me, I would say type it in real quick, or we're probably gonna wrap it up, I would guess.
Yeah, because I haven't been able to keep up with the chat, so I don't know if y'all been asking stuff. I haven't seen them,
It looks like there was a
but
sidebar
if
comment.
not,
Once
that's
once
okay.
energy and essence came up, it looks like people got into that pretty deep here.
I imagine so. That's an entire different discussion and debate. Again, like I said, I think that the essence energy distinction is a legitimate distinction. I don't think a Catholic is bound to the view of Aquinas on the virtual distinction. But there actually is a debate on whether or not the virtual distinction can be reconciled with essence energies. Personally, I don't think it can. But there are those out there who would say that it can be reconciled. But again, nobody is bound to accept Aquinas on this view. And yes, I know what the magisterium taught about the theology of Aquinas, but I also know the magisterium teaches one is free to also hold to the other doctors of the church, such as Duns Scotus, who taught the formal distinction. And if you look at Scholarios and others during the 5th century, they actually said that the formal distinction was pretty much the Catholic analog to the essence and energies. Not on every point. There's differences between the formal distinction and essence and energies on some points. And that's been brought out in one of my interviews with Mark Spencer. But the point here is that there is a bridge there between the formal distinction and the essence and energies distinction. So much more can be said there. I'd love to do a debate or show on that in the future, but we'll table that for now. Here's one for you. Do you consider Jerusalem 1672 as authoritative, or can you dispense with it? You touched on that before, but maybe if you want to just elaborate further on it, do you feel that
Well, as I said before,
you,
I'm not a theologian, so I can't really speak to what level of binding Jerusalem has. I'm familiar with Jerusalem. I'm familiar with some of the statements of Jerusalem. Uh, as far as I can tell, um, it was meant to be a refutation of Calvinism. So
mm,
I don't know. I'd have to read those quotes and see if they're being
mm,
quote mined or if they literally said, hey, look, we all came together and said there's no way you can be saved outside of baptism, because the very plain meaning of what others have taught for unbaptized children, including, like I said, there's a canonized, glorified saint in Orthodoxy. I thought he was venerated in Catholicism, but I get debating views on that. Saint Varus from the 4th century. The whole hagiography of him is, hey, he's the patron of those who are outside of the church and for their salvation. So again, I'm going to have to punt. Maybe you can ask Father Josiah Trenum on that. He'll be very
mm.
facile on that in a way that I'm not.
Let me actually, just for the sake of anybody who's not familiar with 1672, this is from Decree 16. It says, "quote And since infants are men, and as such needing salvation, they need also baptism. And those that are not regenerated, since they have not received the remission of hereditary sin, are of necessity subject to eternal punishment, and consequently cannot without baptism be saved." Now, um, you know, when it comes to councils in Eastern Orthodoxy, they have to be received. If it has not been received by the local church, it cannot be considered, definitive. So you can maybe point to some of the Orthodox churches who perhaps did not receive everything from Jerusalem 1672 as definitive. So that would probably be the response that you would get, is that you are free to reject this decree from the Council of Jerusalem, or the Confession of Dositheus, because it wasn't received by all of the local churches. Now, there's different views of reception too in Eastern Orthodoxy. Some say, well, if it's received by the synod of that local church, then it's binding on them. Others say it has to be received by all the local churches first before it's binding. So there's different views of reception too. It's still an open issue in Eastern Orthodoxy. But
Right.
there it is
As
for
I
the
said,
public
that's
comment.
all I've got. There's a question that was thrown in the chat. It says thoughts from each on laity. Just now it disappeared again. Do you see that one?
Yeah,
Yes, there we
let me bring it up here.
who are not
If it will.
theologians, relying on analysis and guidance of the church and theological commissions. Um, Joshua, if you want to clarify on that, that would be great. I guess first I would just ask Michael an easy question. So, do you consider yourself, for purposes of this question, Michael, to be a theologian? Since you're running the show, I'm guessing you do. But if not, in other words, do you think this pertains to you or doesn't?
I wouldn't identify myself as a theologian, an aspiring lay armchair theologian, maybe. I mean, I have a master's in theology. I don't know if that counts for anything, though. But I would say that if you look at the commentary issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, it's called the Commentary on the Concluding Paragraphs of the Professio Fidei. What it does there is it outlines for you how the magisterium works. It doesn't give you just everything. There's other things that you could read. Father Francis Sullivan wrote a really good book called Creative Fidelity that deals with the different levels of the magisterium and how to weigh them. I would highly suggest it. I don't agree with everything Sullivan says, but as far as understanding the magisterium, he's a pretty good guy to go to. And then also Father Chad Ripperger has some really good stuff on the magisterium. I think one of them is the binding force of tradition, if I'm recalling it correctly. And there's another short book that he wrote called Magisterial Authority that's very helpful. So you could start there. I see that he's also mentioning the International Theological Commission. You could definitely read that. I mean, it's not written for just everybody, I guess. You'd have to have a little bit of background when it comes to theology, but it is a pretty good place if you want to consider of unbaptized infants historically and theologically. I would say that I actually agree with the ITC on this issue. So that's definitely a good place to go to. Do you see any other questions that you wanted to address? Otherwise, we're
Well,
right at
well,
our
I
time
want to
here.
I want to at least answer the question. And first, for full
Hmm.
disclosure, Joshua. Hi, Joshua. He's my nephew. He's Catholic, so we have these
Hmm.
discussions. Um, from an Orthodox perspective, anything that's offered as, hey, this is how you ought to interpret the ecumenical councils, is something that you can take seriously and with gravity, depending on the level of knowledge and holiness, especially of the person involved. But it's not going to have the standard of you must follow this. So much like Michael talks about Chad Rippinger or others who may have good guidance, there may be people that you've discerned as you've studied and looked through it and said, well, these people have very good understanding of how to interpret and how to look at the teachings of the church. But as far as something where it's, man, this is absolutely die hard, you have to take this to the bank, regardless if this commission said one thing and 99 other people in the past have said just the opposite. No, like I think it's called the Land O'Lakes statement by some of the more dissident progressive Catholics, even though there were a lot of clergy and respected clergy in that Land O'Lakes statement, I would say most Catholics would reject that as being pretty bad, regardless of the fact that there were, at the time at least, highly respected Catholic clergy who made that statement.
And there's also a lot of good material in Denzinger, Vatican I, Vatican II, and pre-conciliar popes who taught with the ordinary magisterium at the very least, who explain here's how the magisterium works. They're just dispersed throughout different documents. But if you get your hand on that Francis Sullivan book, you'll see where he's quoting. So it's not just his opinion as a theologian. He's actually showing you in magisterial documents. Here's how the magisterium understands itself, and he goes through canon law and all kinds of documents. So anyways, I think that will do it. So we're going to go ahead and end the stream here in just a second, unless you had any other final concluding thoughts.
No,
I'll give you the last word.
No, it's fine. I appreciate it. First, thanks for having it. Hopefully people listen to us and it got you thinking about what you believe and why. If you do that, if you dig into more to what you believe and what God wants us to believe, that I consider that a success. I know some people say, hey, this guy, meaning me, not very good. That's probably true. I'm not very good. I'm just a dad with 7 kids trying to figure this out. So if you don't like what I've had to say, by all means, don't reject and just move on. And look into some of the things Michael and I have talked about. That's all I would recommend. I'm sorry. I thought I saw a question, but I think it disappeared. So never mind. So that's all I got.
The chat's always moving on me too. I hate that. It's hard to pin it down.
Yep.
Unless I write down the timestamp, it's usually gone forever for me.
Gotcha.
So, yeah. Anyways, again, thank you so much for coming on, Al. I truly enjoyed it. You are welcome on anytime.
All right. Hey, thanks, Michael. It's been great.
Okay. Take care, sir.
All right. Bye-bye.
Everyone, thank you for watching. Please comment, like, subscribe, share this material on your social media. Until next time, God bless you all.